In the stuffy, lime dust-filled air of the underground corridor, a barely audible sound echoed. A drop of water, having broken free from the vault, shattered against a dry stone. For thousands of people frozen in the darkness, this sound was more precious than a volley of artillery fire or a triumphant march. In May of 42, near Kerch, time seemed to slow its pace, turning into an endless wait between an inhale and an exhale. A group of soldiers, pressed against the cold walls of the catacombs, listened intently to the silence of the surface, where life had recently buzzed, but now metal and flame reigned supreme. In the young lieutenant's hands was a gripped, empty mess tin, and everyone in this group understood that a trip for water today could be the last act in their biography. But there was no choice, just as there was no way back. Above them, on the surface, stretched the Crimean steppe, bathed in the spring sun, and here, at a depth of 30 meters, began a story that would make future generations shudder and raise questions for historians that still have no definitive answers. The catastrophe of the Crimean front in mid-May of 42 arrived with terrifying speed. Just a week before the events described, Soviet command was planning a large-scale offensive, aiming for the complete liberation of the peninsula and the deblockade of Sevastopol. On the narrow Kerch Peninsula, colossal forces were concentrated: 3 armies, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of guns. However, strategic miscalculations by the leadership and an underestimation of the enemy's maneuverability led to the front collapsing in just a few days. German tank wedges sliced through the defenses, creating chaos in command and supply. While belated decisions on regrouping were being made at the very top, thousands of soldiers found themselves pressed against the strait. Evacuation to the Taman shore turned into a dramatic ordeal, where there was a catastrophic shortage of watercraft, and enemy aviation completely controlled the sky. At this moment, as the main forces tried to cross the narrow water barrier, the need arose to create a rear guard, those who could delay the enemy's advance towards ports and crossings for at least a few days. The choice fell on the area of the village of Adzhimushkay, where shell rock had been mined since ancient times, leaving behind an extensive network of underground workings. The huge labyrinths, known as the Great and Small Catacombs, seemed like a natural fortress. Remnants of various units began to gather here: aviation school cadets, soldiers of the reserve of the High Command Regiment, border guards, and support units. Along with them, hundreds of civilians, elderly people, women, and children also went underground, seeking refuge from endless bombardments and rapidly advancing tank columns. None of them then assumed that the temporary shelter would turn into a voluntary prison for a long 170 days. The situation was complicated by the fact that there was initially no organized order for a prolonged defense, specifically in underground conditions. People went under the arches of the catacombs spontaneously, obeying the instinct of self-preservation and the orders of local commanders to hold the defense until the last possible moment. The leadership of the Crimean front was at this time already on the Caucasian shore, trying to comprehend the scale of the defeat that had occurred. Communication with the units surrounded in Adzhimushkay was unstable and soon ceased altogether. Finding themselves in complete isolation, the defenders of the catacombs faced a reality for which no army in the world was prepared. In the underground galleries, according to various estimates, 10 to 15,000 people gathered. They had weapons, ammunition, and the will to resist, but almost entirely lacked food supplies and, most terrifyingly, sources of drinking water. On the surface, the enemy quickly realized that a large and dangerous pocket of resistance remained behind their lines. Surrounding the quarry area with a tight cordon, enemy units switched to a war of attrition. The first attempts to dislodge the defenders from underground with frontal assaults failed. Their knowledge of the labyrinth and the fanatical tenacity of the encircled made the underground fortress impregnable. Then began the systematic blocking of all exits and, most cynically, the destruction of wells. In the Adzhimushkay area, water had always been worth its weight in gold, and the few sources were located outside. The enemy blocked them with stones, poisoned them, or set up round-the-clock machine gun nests that swept every meter of the approaches to the life-giving moisture. Thus began the battle for water, which became one of the most tragic pages of this defense. Inside the quarries, a unique command system was established in the shortest possible time. Colonel Pavel Yagunov, who assumed overall command, understood that without the strictest discipline, a multi-thousand-strong mass of people in a confined space was doomed to rapid disintegration. A staff was formed, commandant services were created, a hospital was organized, and even workshops for repairing weapons were set up. People lived by a strict routine, where every gram of food and every spoonful of water was distributed by ration cards. Light was provided by makeshift lamps made from artillery shells, fueled by technical oil, and the only sources of information about the outside world remained rare radio intercepts and reports from scouts who carried out daring night sorties. The external conflict unfolded according to the laws of a classic siege, but under extreme conditions. The enemy, irritated that a handful of encircled forces were diverting significant resources, began to employ barbaric methods. One such method was the use of gas. Ventilation shafts and entrances to the quarries were bombarded with gas canisters containing poisonous substances. The first gas attack caught people off guard. In a confined space with no air movement, the gas acted instantly and mercilessly. Those who did not manage to cover their respiratory tracts with wet rags or retreat into the depths of the distant galleries lost their lives by the hundreds. This was a direct violation of all international conventions, but in the conditions of total confrontation on the Eastern Front, such norms were ignored. However, even gas did not break the will of the defenders. They learned to build airtight partitions, create gas patrol posts, and continued to return fire to every enemy attempt to enter. Parallel to the military confrontation, a deep internal conflict unfolded in the souls of thousands of people. Every soldier and officer trapped underground went through an agonizing choice. On one hand, there was the military oath and a clear understanding that their resistance was diverting enemy forces from Sevastopol and the Caucasus. On the other hand, there was unbearable suffering, hunger, and the cries of children who, along with the adults, shared the hardships of underground life. The moral state of the garrison was maintained thanks to the incredible authority of the commanders and a common sense of involvement in a great cause. But behind this facade lay personal dramas. The realization that you had been abandoned by your own high command, which at that time was reporting the successful completion of the evacuation, caused bitterness. Many wondered, why did such a huge front with colossal resources suffer such a crushing defeat? The personal responsibility of the leaders of the Crimean front, such as Meklis and Kozlov, hung in the air of the quarries like an invisible shadow. While ordinary soldiers drank condensation from the walls, licking drops of moisture from the cold stone, those who made fatal decisions on the surface were already safe. This contrast between the sacrifice of the lower ranks and the incompetence of the upper echelons became the ideological fault line that defined the psychological atmosphere of Adzhimushkay. Nevertheless, the thirst for revenge and the sense of duty proved stronger than resentment. People chose resistance not because they were ordered to, but because they could not do otherwise. The inner world of the quarries became a kind of miniature society, where human qualities manifested in their utmost concentration. There was no room for pretense here. A coward became obvious in the first minute of battle, and a hero in the daily routine of survival. Surprisingly, culture continued to exist in these inhumane conditions. Soldiers wrote poems, kept diaries, and doctors in the hospital performed real miracles, operating by the light of oil lamps and using kitchen knives or sharpened pieces of metal as instruments. This was the triumph of the human spirit over the biological frailty of the body, which demanded food and water, but received only orders and faith in victory. The ideological conflict of this story lies in the clash of two value systems. For the advancing side, the defenders of Adzhimushkay were fanatics with no chance of success, whose resistance had no military meaning. From the perspective of the German command, it would have been more reasonable to surrender and save lives. But for the Soviet soldier of that time, surrender was often tantamount to betrayal or slow fading away in camps. Here, underground, they remained masters of their fate. It was a manifesto of freedom in its most paradoxical manifestation: the freedom to choose the way to end one's life. The garrison's steadfastness became a symbol that was meant to prove that even in absolute darkness, one can remain a light for others. The fate of civilians occupied a special place in this ideological confrontation. Women and children, trapped, became the heaviest burden on the defenders' conscience. The Quarry Command repeatedly tried to negotiate with the enemy for the evacuation of civilians to the surface, but the conditions put forward by the enemy were often unacceptable to the military. The sight of emaciated children, whose eyes glowed in the twilight of the galleries, was more powerful than any words. Ultimately, many civilians were forced to go to the surface when food supplies were completely exhausted, but their testimonies about life underground became the first documents of this tragedy. The transformation of the perception of events occurred in July of '42. By this time, Sevastopol had fallen, and hopes for a quick unblocking of the Kerch Peninsula had finally collapsed. The defenders of Adzhimushkay realized that they were left alone with the enemy for an indefinite period. If earlier their actions were considered a temporary delay of the enemy, now it became an autonomous war in the rear. Tactics changed. Night sorties became more daring and large-scale. Soldiers went to the surface not only for water, but also for weapons, ammunition, and food, raiding enemy warehouses and garrisons. The quarries became an _0_ that continued to exist against all logic of war. The culmination of the defense came in the autumn, when the defenders' forces were almost exhausted. Shells and cartridges were running out, and hunger reached such a degree that people could barely move their legs. The enemy began to use directed explosions of colossal power, trying to collapse the arches of the quarries on the heads of those who remained there. Huge blocks weighing hundreds of tons fell, burying entire detachments and hospitals alive. The underground world was turning into one large mass grave. However, even then, when only hundreds remained alive out of many thousands, organized resistance did not cease. The last defenders continued to fire as long as they had the ability to hold weapons in their hands. When, at the end of October 1942, the last pockets of resistance were suppressed, even the enemy was forced to acknowledge the unparalleled courage of these people. The few survivors, utterly exhausted, were taken prisoner, but their spirit remained unvanquished. The defense of Adzhimushkay entered history as an example of what a person is capable of for the sake of their ideals and sense of duty. But at the same time, it left a bitter aftertaste of the question about the price of this sacrifice. Was this tragedy inevitable, or could it have been avoided with a different approach from the supreme leadership? The resonance of this story is felt even today. We look at the events in Kerch not just as an episode of a distant war, but as a deep philosophical inquiry into human nature. In a world where comfort is often prioritized over principles, Adzhimushkay reminds us of the existence of other categories of being. This is a story about how, even in conditions of total injustice and abandonment, a person retains the right to an honorable act. The lesson of Adzhimushkay is that loyalty to oneself and one's comrades is the highest form of personal sovereignty, which cannot be taken away by gas, explosions, or thirst. Today, when we analyze the actions of the command of the Crimean front, we see a classic example of how administrative incompetence and fear of responsibility can lead to catastrophic consequences for thousands of people. This is a warning for all times. Leadership is not only privileges, but above all, responsibility for the lives of those who have entrusted themselves to you. The heroism of the soldiers in the quarries became an atonement for the mistakes of the generals, and herein lies the deep tragedy of any great war. We are obliged to remember not only the feat, but also the reasons that made this feat necessary. The underground halls of Adzhimushkay still bear inscriptions on their walls, made with charcoal and bayonets. These are messages from another world, where every day was a struggle for the right to remain human. A modern visitor to these places feels the air change, becoming heavier with the realization of the scale of what happened. Here, silence speaks louder than any words. And if you listen closely, you can hear that very drop of water that once gave hope to a young lieutenant in the darkness. This drop is a symbol of the continuity of life and memory, seeping through decades, not letting us forget those who remained in stone forever. Returning to that scene at the beginning of our narrative, we see that the mess tin in the hands of the soldier is not just an item of utensil, but a grail in a world where all values are inverted. The steadfastness shown in Adzhimushkay was not in vain. It became part of the foundation upon which the understanding of the victory of spirit over matter was built. And although many names of the defenders still remain unknown, their collective feat continues to resonate in our hearts, making us ponder what we are willing to do for our convictions at a decisive moment. The history of Adzhimushkay is a mirror, reflecting all the best and worst in humanity. On one hand, the cynicism and incompetence of the authorities who abandoned their defenders. On the other, the absolute loyalty and self-sacrifice of those who, until their last breath, believed in the justice of their cause. This dichotomy makes the events of 1942 not just a chronicle of hostilities, but an epic canvas of the struggle between light and shadow, unfolding in the very depths of the human soul. And as long as we remember this, the light ignited in the quarries of Kerch continues to burn, illuminating the path to understanding the true value of human life and dignity. Concluding this immersion into history, it's worth noting that the quarries are not only a place of memory, but also a living reminder that history is written not only in headquarters, but also in the hearts of ordinary people. Everyone who found themselves there contributed to the common cause, even if that contribution was merely to support a comrade in a moment of despair. This is the great mystery of Adzhimushkay. How, in conditions of absolute hopelessness, people were able to create a space of hope that outlived them and continues to inspire us decades later. Gazing into the darkness of the underground corridors, we understand that true heroism does not require fanfare. It is often silent, covered in dust, and devoid of external brilliance. But it is precisely this core that prevents the world from falling apart in moments of its greatest trials. The defense of Adzhimushkay will forever remain in memory as a symbol of this invisible but indestructible core. As proof that even the deepest darkness cannot swallow the true greatness of the human spirit. This story teaches us that in any situation, even the most critical, there remains room for choice. The defenders of the quarries could have chosen the path of least resistance, but they chose a path that led them to immortality. And this decision, made thousands of times by every individual fighter, woman, or doctor, became the very answer to the challenge of fate that makes humanity great. We cannot change the past, but we can change our attitude towards it, drawing strength from it to overcome the challenges of our own time. Adzhimushkay is not just a point on a map or a page in a textbook. It is an eternal question addressed to each of us. What are you willing to do for truth, for your loved ones, for your land? And as long as this question resonates, as long as we seek answers to it, the feat of the defenders of the underground fortress remains alive and relevant. This is the highest form of recognition and gratitude, not just to remember dates and numbers, but to feel a living connection with those who, in fortitude, chose cold stone over betrayal and darkness over dishonor. Decades later, as gardens bloom and cities buzz on the surface of Kerch, the quarries remain a silent witness to how the steel of human character was forged. This is a place of power, where every stone is steeped in history and every breath reminds us of the price of peace. And as the sun sets beyond the horizon, painting the steppe in crimson tones, it seems that the shadows of the defenders are still at their post, guarding the peace of their land and our memory of what it means to be human. The story ends, but the reflection does not. Every new detail discovered by searchers in the depths of the galleries, every established fact, is another step towards understanding the grand drama that unfolded in Adzhimushkay. And in this continuous process of knowledge, we ourselves become purer and wiser, touching the absolute truth that was revealed to the world in those distant and terrible days. Let the memory of this defense be for us not only a burden of the past, but also a guiding star into the future, where courage and responsibility will always go hand in hand, creating a world worthy of the hero's memory. Ultimately, the story of Adzhimushkay is a story of love for life, which made people fight for every breath, of love for the motherland, which gave them the strength to stand until the end, and of love for humanity, for which these people sacrificed themselves, believing that their suffering would be a guarantee of a better future. This love is stronger than death, and it is the main outcome and the main lesson of the quarry defense, the echo of which will resonate through the centuries, reminding us of what is most important. Again, the sound of a falling drop is heard in the silence of the underground hall. It falls into the cup of memory, reminding us that nothing is forgotten and no one is forgotten. And in this rhythm of eternity, we find our place, our understanding of duty, and our responsibility to those who once, in darkness and cold, chose light and honor. History continues in us, and our task is to carry this torch further, not allowing it to fade under the winds of oblivion or indifference. Adzhimushkay lives as long as we remember it, and this memory is our main victory over time and darkness. Each of us, having touched upon this theme, carries away a particle of that harsh and sublime truth. This does not make life easier, but it makes it more significant. We understand that behind every dry fact in a textbook stand living feelings, fears, and hopes. And this realization makes us more sensitive to the present, more demanding of ourselves, and more grateful to fate for a peaceful sky. May the lessons of the past always be for us not only a warning, but also a source of inspiration for creating a world where such feats will never again be needed, but the memory of them will be preserved forever. Thus, the circle of time closes, connecting us with those who, in May of 42nd, stepped under the vaults of the quarries, to remain there forever. Their history is our common code of identity, our moral compass. And looking into the future, we take with us their steadfastness, their faith, and their unbroken spirit, knowing that as long as this memory lives in us, we are invincible. Adzhimushkay is not an end. It is the beginning of an endless path to understanding the greatness of the human soul. And we must walk this path together, remaining faithful to the ideals for which the defenders of the underground fortress fought and died. In the silence of the Crimean night, when the stars are reflected in the waters of the strait, the Adzhimushkay quarries seem like a sleeping giant guarding its secrets. But this is not a dream. It is the eternal vigil of memory. And each time we return to this story, we are as if lighting a small candle in that infinite darkness, making the world a little brighter and more humane. May this candle burn long, reminding us that true greatness does not need loud words. It lives in actions and in our ability to remember and honor those who came before us. Completing this journey through time and space, we leave the heroes of Adzhimushkay in their eternal rest, but we take their history into our daily lives. Let it become for us a measure of actions and a source of wisdom in difficult moments. For this is what history exists for, to teach us to be human in any, even the most inhumane, conditions. And in this sense, the defense of the quarries continues in each of us when we choose truth, dignity, and honor.